Good afternoon, EDH enthusiasts. My name is Flynn, and welcome to a Commander deck profile. One of the coolest legendary creatures from Modern Horizons 3 was the Necrobloom, a 2/7 plant for 1, a white, a black, and a green. It has Landfall, where whenever a land enters under your control, you create a 0/1 green plant creature token. But if you control 7 or more lands with different names, you instead create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Finally, lands in your graveyard have Dredge 2. The Dredge ability allows you to return a land from your graveyard to your hand by milling 2 cards instead of drawing a card. Basically, this gives you a replacement effect, where you can trade in an instance of card draw with recurring one of your lands from the graveyard and milling yourself 2. I think this deck has a very high ceiling, and while I'm normally not much of a fan of landfall decks, I think that this is doing something a little bit different that's both very interesting and something that I like. We not only are getting tokens off of our land drops, which will help us get bodies onto the battlefield, but the Dredge 2 that we put on our lands in the graveyard gives us a unique approach to graveyard recursion. See, a popular land category in Commander is a fetch land. These lands allow us to search for a land and put it into play, giving us an additional landfall trigger off of the Necrobloom. When that land enters the graveyard, it'll also gain Dredge 2, allowing us to return it to our hand the next time that we would draw a card, and I like this option being open to us. The secondary effect of the landfall trigger is also really powerful. If you construct your land base in such a way that you're only running 1 copy of each land, even including your basics, you'll quickly hit that threshold to begin making 2/2 zombies. This is very reminiscent of Field of the Dead, a non-basic that enters play tapped, and you can tap for a colorless mana. Whenever it or another land enters play under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. With this single land alone, we already have redundancy on this ability, and so I approach this deck's land base much more carefully. I don't normally go into land bases since they are very much subject to financial limitations, but this deck would benefit the most from having the greatest number of differently named lands. My build specifically utilizes the 3 fetches that are in our colors, being Marsh Flats, Verdant Catacombs, and Windswept Heath, which can each search for any lands with the specific land types. These are our optimal fetches because they don't specify that the target needs to be a basic land. Next, we have the 3 shock lands, which all have, again, the basic land types, while also being non-basic dual lands. We also are on the Surveil lands, as they too have the basic land types, are dual lands to help with the color fixing, and their Surveil ability might help us pitch a card to the bin. Indotha Triome and the Murmuring Bosk rounds out our fetchable non-basic lands, giving us a decent number of targets to search for once our 3 basic lands are out. We have a powerful synergy for cutting cards into the bin via the 3 cycle lands. These have a unique interaction with the Necrobloom, as they can be discarded to cycle themselves, which would normally you draw a card after their cost of 1 mana and their being discarded is paid, but you can then choose to utilize their Dredge 2 to return them to your hand instead, which won't draw you any cards, but it will help fill up your graveyard. The land base of this deck is largely where the bulk of the cost of putting this deck together falls. If you look at the Moxfield deck list, that I will put into the description of this video, we do run some pricey lands in our optimal build, but these are not necessary to play this deck successfully. So if your budget doesn't allow for these expensive cards, you can simply swap them out for others that are more affordable. We are on some spells that will help get those lands into the bin. Constant Mists is a super helpful fog ability, protecting you from combat damage, but you can also use the buyback ability while casting it, sacrificing land to have the Constant Mists return to your hand after it resolves. This can, in theory, be used to protect ourselves on each of our opponent's turns. Squandering Resources is a 2-mana enchantment that lets you sacrifice a land to add 1 mana of any color that the sacrificed land could produce. Now then, those 2s are also both rather pricey at over $20 a pop, and if you feel that these are a little too expensive, you can absolutely swap them out with something like Zuran Orb, which is much more budget friendly. Zombie Infestation is a bit of a pet card in here, allowing us to pitch 2 cards from our hand to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, giving us another way to make zombies. Ripples of Undeath gives us a main phase mill 3 trigger, which we can then pay 1 mana and 3 life to return one of those 3 milled cards to our hand. An oldie but a goodie, the Knight of the Reliquary is in here to help with our mana fixing, allowing us to trade in a forest or a plains to get any land from our deck into play. Now, also along those same lines, White of the Reliquary allows us to trade in our creatures for a land, though those enter play tapped. Each of these are great ways to get additional land drops per turn. Now this also will lead us into our secondary strategy, our tokens. This deck has the capacity to produce a good number of tokens, and so we want to make the most of them once they begin to spawn. And we are very much going for a plants vs zombies situation here, and I found it very inspiring to work with these two creature types. We'll begin with the zombie cards. Binding Mummy is a white zombie with a triggered ability. Whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under your control, you can tap down a target artifact or creature, and this will handle some problem artifacts and blockers. Corpse Harvester lets us pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice a creature to tutor for both a zombie card and a swamp card, which is a pretty unique 2-for-1 kind of tutor. Corpse Knight pings the table each time another creature enters under our control. Crypt Breaker gives us another discard outlet that might help us put lands in the bin, and it has a draw engine attached to utilize those zombies to draw more cards. In this deck's case, we get another option to return a land to our hand. Tato Farmer is a zombie that gives us 2 radiation counters whenever a land enters under our control. Radiation or rad counters mill us 1 card per rad counter, and then when we mill a non-land card, those counters start to go away. You can also tap the farmer to return a target land in a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control tapped. This can be used on your opponent's land should they be somehow on milling strategies too, but this largely will be used to return our own lands that we mill to the battlefield. Wayward Servant also pings the table whenever another zombie enters under our control. Next, let's discuss our plants. The Avenger of Zendikar is perhaps the most iconic of them and the most powerful, giving us a sort of reverse landfall trigger upon it entering, creating a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land we control. Next, it has a normal landfall ability, putting a +1/+1 counter onto each plant we control, which can then help bulk up our otherwise toothless plant tokens. Bristly Bill Spinesower has a landfall ability that puts a +1/+1 counter onto a target creature, and then for 5 mana you can double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. This synergizes very nicely with the Avenger and can help us bulk up our army of tokens. Centaur Vinecrasher enters with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of lands in all graveyards and has Trample. Whenever a land is put into the graveyard from anywhere, you can pay 2 green to return it from the graveyard to your hand, giving it some self-recursion. This can be a great option to help power through opponent blockers. Dune Chanter turns your lands into deserts and rainbow lands, allowing you to tap it for any color. You can also tap it to mill 2 and then gain 1 life for each land milled this way. This helps with our mana fixing should we be somehow struggling to get into our colors, and it can help us pitch cards to the graveyard. Rambleweed is in some ways an on-theme win condition, giving our creatures +3/+3 and trample when it enters, though despite it costing 11 mana, the more lands that we have in our graveyard, the cheaper that mana cost will really be. This gives us an odd choice, where we want to maintain some lands in the bin, as our main strategy will be dredging them from the graveyard to our hand. But since this commander wants us to get lands into play, let's discuss some methods that are unique to this deck. Perhaps my 2 favorite methods of doing this are Awaken the Woods and Staff of Titania. These each will create a number of 1/1 Green Forest Dryad land creature tokens. These are basically token versions of Dryad Arbor, a card that is uniquely both a land and a creature. These will trigger our landfall cards, though unless you've already met the prerequisite of controlling 7 lands with different names, this will only net you the 0/1 plant tokens off of our commander. Awaken the Woods also runs the possibility of creating many more land creature tokens at once, which can lead to a tremendous swell in mana. But since these are also considered creatures, they do also have summoning sickness, preventing you from using them straight away for their mana abilities. Life of the Loam is our only real dredge card in the deck, returning 3 cards from our graveyard to our hand, and it having dredge 3 on its own. Eerie Ultimatum returns any number of permanent cards with different names to the battlefield from the graveyard, and due to our deck's specific construction, this can return everything in our graveyard to the battlefield. Splendid Reclamation will return all of our lands to the battlefield tapped. Horn of Greed allows for some nice fun, letting us draw a card whenever we play a land. This does also benefit our opponents, but we will be breaking parity with this by simply going much further with our land drop shenanigans. The goal of this deck is to ensure that we're hitting multiple land drops as often as possible. It's easy to recur our lands from the graveyard given our commander's abilities. We will make tokens from the various sources, bulk up those tokens, and this will eventually give us the board state to simply swing sideways and take out our opponents. If we have amassed enough of a board state, something like a Beastmaster Ascension can really help pump up our army to push through for that last bit of damage. I think the Necrobloom is one of the more unique landfall commanders, one that's doing more than simply putting lands into the battlefield. We want to maintain the ability to recur our lands, replay our lands, and this allows us multiple usages of some key lands. There is a lot of flexibility in your deck construction with this, so don't be discouraged by a highly priced card. Budget variants do exist and should be explored, and we may revisit this in the near future to look at a budget build of the Necrobloom. But for now, that will wrap up our look at this deck. What do you think of our build? Is this something you would personally run? Let me know in the comments section if you have any spicy tech for this. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, likes and shares are always greatly appreciated. If you're new, remember to subscribe so you'll never miss an upload, and as always, I'll catch you all next video.